Winter had settled over Ashford Hall like a shroud, wrapping the great estate in layers of frost and silence that seemed to mirror the coldness within its ancient walls. Lady Charlotte Ashford, Marchioness of Thornwick, stood at the window of her vast bedchamber, her breath forming ghostly patterns on the glass as she gazed out at gardens gone skeletal and grey. The room behind her stretched cavernous and empty, all damask and gilt and ornate furnishings that belonged to generations of Thornwick brides, women whose portraits lined the gallery downstairs with their painted eyes and knowing smiles. Women who had perhaps also learned that a title was poor compensation for warmth. She pressed her palm against the cold window and allowed herself to remember, though remembrance brought only a dull ache that had become her constant companion. 6 months prior, she had stood in the chapel of her father's estate, draped in Brussels lace and orange blossoms, her hand trembling as it was placed into that of the Marquess Edmund Thornwick. He had been imposing even then, tall and broad-shouldered, his features carved in aristocratic lines that might have been handsome had they ever softened with feeling. But his eyes, those grey eyes that should have held some flicker of tenderness on their wedding day, had been as cold and remote as winter stars. She had known, of course. Her father had been frank, if not precisely kind, in his explanations. The Thornwick estate teetered on the precipice of ruin, brought low by the late Marquess's excesses and years of mismanagement. Edmund needed capital. Her father needed connections, the prestige of an ancient title for his merchant fortune. And Charlotte was the currency of exchange, the bridge between necessity and ambition. £50,000, her dowry had been. £50,000 to restore the crumbling grandeur of Ashford Hall, to pay the creditors circling like ravens, to resurrect a dying legacy. She had understood the transaction with painful clarity as she signed the marriage documents, her new husband's hand steady and emotionless beside hers, his signature bold where hers wavered. A most satisfactory arrangement, her father had said at the wedding breakfast, raising his glass to the Marquess, who had inclined his head with cool courtesy. Edmund had not looked at her during the toast. He had barely looked at her throughout the entire day, his attention directed to the business of the thing, the property transferred, the contract sealed. That night, when he had come to her chambers to fulfill the marital duty that would secure an heir, he had been efficient and silent, and afterward had returned to his own apartments without a word. She was a financial instrument. She had understood then with crystalline certainty. A very expensive financial instrument, carefully acquired and properly documented, and nothing more. Charlotte turned from the window now, 6 months a wife and still so profoundly alone, and wondered how many more winters she would spend in these beautiful, terrible rooms, married and yet more isolated than she had ever been in her father's house, bound by law and faith to a man who had purchased her services and wanted nothing of her heart. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. The first months of marriage passed with the slow, aching quality of a wound that would not heal, each day bleeding into the next, with such sameness that Charlotte might have lost track of time entirely, had not the servants marked the weeks with their quiet routines. Edmund's coldness settled over their union like the frost that never quite left the north-facing rooms of Ashford Hall, beautiful in its crystalline perfection and utterly inhospitable to any warmth of feeling. His visits to her chambers came with perfunctory regularity in those early weeks' duty calls. She understood them to be the necessary attentions to secure an heir, and each time he would arrive with that same shuttered expression, perform what was required with mechanical precision, and depart again without any words beyond the barest courtesies. "Good evening, Lady Thornwick. I trust you are well. Good night." She had tried in the beginning to bridge the chasm between them. At dinners in the vast dining room where they sat at opposite ends of a table that could seat 30, she would venture topics of conversation: the weather, the estate, books she had read, questions about his childhood, or his preferences, or his thoughts on anything at all. His responses came in monosyllables when they came at all. "Indeed, perhaps, I have no opinion on the matter." More often, he would simply nod or offer a slight shake of his head, his attention ostensibly on his meal or on some distant thought that excluded her entirely. And Charlotte would fall silent again, acutely aware of the servants moving like shadows along the walls, their expressions carefully neutral, but their eyes holding an unmistakable sympathy that burned worse than contempt might have. She took to dining in her rooms, unable to bear the charade of companionship where none existed, and Edmund did not question or protest her absence, which confirmed what she already knew. He was relieved not to endure even those minimal interactions. His life occurred elsewhere, in the parts of Ashford Hall she did not occupy. His study, where lamplight burned until the early hours of morning as he bent over account books and correspondence, managing the estate that her £50,000 had rescued from ruin. The stables, where he rode out at dawn and returned at dusk. The tenant farms, which he visited with his steward, attending to the business of the land with a dedication that might have been admirable had he spared even a fraction of such attention for his wife. She learned his routines by their absence from her life, the negative space he left behind more present than any actual interaction. One evening in late January, Charlotte sat alone in the drawing room, attempting to focus on her embroidery, when Mrs. Hewitt brought in the post. Among the letters was one in Edmund's hand, already sealed, addressed to her father. "His lordship asked that this be sent with tomorrow's rider, my lady," the housekeeper said gently, and something in her tone made Charlotte reach for it, turning it over in her hands. The seal was still warm. She should not have done what she did next. She knew it even as her fingers worked beneath the wax, careful not to break it entirely, unfolding the thick paper to read words not meant for her eyes. "My dear Sir Robert," it began, in Edmund's bold script, "I write to express once more my gratitude for your generous investment in the Thornwick estate. The repairs to the east wing progress admirably, and the tenant farms show excellent promise for the spring planting. Your capital has proven as sound an investment as the merchant ventures that built your own considerable fortune. The alliance between our families does credit to us both." Charlotte's hands trembled as she read on, finding detailed accountings of expenditures and improvements, acknowledgments of her father's business acumen, expressions of satisfaction with the arrangement, and not once, not in a single line of that lengthy letter, did Edmund mention her name or acknowledge her as anything more than the mechanism by which her father's money had transferred to Thornwick coffers. She sealed it again with shaking fingers and gave it back to Mrs. Hewitt. And that night, alone in her vast bed in her vast chamber, Charlotte wept into her pillow with the particular despair of understanding that she was not even resented or disliked. She was simply irrelevant, a transaction completed, a tool properly purchased and filed away, and nothing more. The change came upon Charlotte so gradually that at first she attributed the peculiar sensations to the persistent melancholy that had become her daily companion, the nausea and fatigue merely symptoms of a spirit gone sick with loneliness. But when her monthly courses failed to arrive for the second time, and Mrs. Hewitt gently inquired after her health with knowing eyes, Charlotte understood what her body had been telling her, and the realization struck her with such complexity of feeling that she had to sit down in the morning room, her hand pressed to her still flat stomach, her mind racing through all the tangled implications of this development. A child. She was carrying Edmund's child, the heir he had married her to produce, the final component of their mercenary arrangement now growing within her. She waited 3 days before telling him, those days filled with a tumult of conflicting emotions that kept her awake at night, staring at the canopy of her bed and trying to pass what she felt. There was fear. Certainly she had heard the stories whispered among women, the dangers of childbed, the agony of labor, and now her own body would become the vessel for that ancient trial. There was a spark of hope, fragile as a candle flame in winter wind, that perhaps this news might soften something in Edmund, might give him reason to see her as more than the purchased instrument of his estate's salvation. And beneath both fear and hope, unexpected and insistent, grew a fierce joy that surprised her with its strength. She would be a mother, would hold a child of her own, and even if Edmund remained forever cold, she would have this one person to love and be loved by in return. On the third evening, as the March wind howled around Ashford Hall and the last light faded from the western sky, Charlotte steeled herself and made her way to Edmund's study, in that sanctuary she had never before presumed to enter uninvited. She knocked, heard his distracted command to enter, and found him bent over his ledgers as always, his dark hair falling across his forehead, his shirt sleeves rolled back, the very picture of a man absorbed in matters of importance. He looked up at her entrance, surprise flickering across his features, She so rarely sought him out, and then he rose, formal as ever, waiting for her to speak. "My lord," she began, her voice steadier than she felt, her hands clasped before her to still their trembling. "I have news that I believe will be of interest to you. I am with child." The physician confirmed it this morning. She watched his face as she spoke, hungry for any sign of warmth, any crack in that impenetrable reserve, and saw only a moment of stillness before his expression shifted into something she could not quite read. Not joy, certainly, but perhaps satisfaction. The look of a man whose investment had proven sound. "An heir," he said, his voice measured and even, as if she had reported a successful harvest or a favorable settlement. "Good, that is." He paused, seeming to search for words, and then finished with devastating formality. "That is satisfactory, Lady Thornwick." He did not ask after her well-being, did not inquire about her health or her fears, and did not cross the space between them to take her hand or offer any gesture of shared feeling toward this child they had created. He simply inclined his head, that small acknowledgement of information received, and Charlotte felt something inside her chest crack and crumble, that fragile hope, extinguishing as quickly as it had kindled. She managed a curtsy, and managed words she could not later recall, and retreated from his study with whatever dignity she could gather, making her way back to her chambers through corridors that had never seemed so long or so empty. Only when her door was closed and locked behind her, only when she was certain no servant would hear, did Charlotte sink onto her bed and weep with the particular desolation of understanding that even this, even the child they had made together, would not bridge the frozen waste between them. The months of Charlotte's confinement passed with the slow unfurling of seasons, winter's harsh grip giving way to the tender greens of April, then the fuller blooms of May, and through it all she moved through Ashford Hall like a ghost gaining substance, her body changing in ways both wondrous and frightening, while Edmund remained as distant as ever, a shadow glimpsed in corridors, a figure disappearing into his study, a presence felt only by its deliberate absence. Her belly swelled, modest at first and then unmistakable, and with it grew her attachment to the child within. She would sit in her chambers, with her hands pressed to the place where tiny feet kicked and tumbled, whispering stories and promises to this small soul who knew nothing yet of the cold house into which it would be born. And in those moments, Charlotte felt less alone than she had since her wedding day. The gardens became her refuge as spring warmed into summer, the walking paths where she could escape the pitying glances of servants and the suffocating silence of empty rooms, and she traced the same circuits day after day, her pace slowing as her burden grew heavier, watching the roses bloom and fade, the lavender come into its purple glory, the whole estate showing more life and warmth than its master's heart. She wrote letters to her sister Amelia, long missives that tried and failed to capture the peculiar sorrow of her situation. How did one explain being married yet utterly alone, being with child yet having no husband with whom to share either the fears or the small joys of impending parenthood? And Amelia's responses, full of concern and love, only emphasized how far Charlotte was from anyone who truly knew her. Mrs. Hewitt became the single source of human warmth in Charlotte's days, the housekeeper whose brisk efficiency masked a motherly concern, who brought her tea without asking, and sat with her on difficult mornings when the sickness was particularly bad, who spoke to her of commonplace things that made Charlotte feel human rather than merely ornamental, who once, daringly, took Charlotte's hand and said, "His lordship is not an easy man, my lady, but he is not unkind, only wounded, I think, in ways that make him forget how to be soft." And though Charlotte appreciated the attempt at comfort, she could not quite believe it. What she did not see, could not know, were the moments when Edmund stood at the windows of his study or his chambers, watching her walk the gardens below. His expression unguarded in those private moments, something flickering across his features that might have been longing or regret or some emotion he himself could not have named. She did not see how his gaze would follow her slight figure, how his hand would press against the glass as if he might reach through it to steady her when she paused to rest, how he would stand there long after she had gone inside, staring at the empty path she had walked, before turning sharply away and burying himself once more in ledgers and correspondence, in anything that might distract him from the ache that grew larger with each passing week. Charlotte only knew that she was alone, that she carried their child in solitude, and that whatever small hope she had harbored that pregnancy might bridge the chasm between them had proven as insubstantial as morning mist, burned away by the cold sun of Edmund's continued indifference. Edmund Thornwick had learned the architecture of emotional distance at his father's knee, though not through instruction, but through bitter observation, watching the late Marquess drink and gamble and womanize his way through the family fortune with the single-minded dedication of a man determined to destroy everything his ancestors had built. And Edmund had been 17 when his mother died, not of any illness the physicians could name, but simply of heartbreak, of the accumulated weight of humiliations endured and hopes extinguished. And as he stood at her graveside in the rain, he had made a vow that felt like iron settling into his bones. He would never be his father, would never allow passion or sentiment or the weakness of feeling to compromise duty, would restore what had been squandered, and would do it through discipline and cold practicality, through the absolute subjugation of anything so unreliable as the heart. The mercenary marriage had been, in his assessment, not merely practical but honorable. In its very honesty, he had needed capital to save the estate from complete ruin. Charlotte's father had wanted a title for his daughter, and Edmund had been scrupulously clear about the nature of the arrangement. No false promises of affection, no performance of feelings he had trained himself not to possess, just a straightforward transaction that served both parties' interests. That Charlotte herself might have hoped for something different, might have brought to their union some tenderness or expectation of companionship, was a consideration he had deliberately avoided, telling himself that distance was a kind of kindness, that she deserved better than his damaged and defended heart, that she would be happier with the freedom of his indifference than she would be shackled to a man who had forgotten how to be soft. But in the private moments he did not examine too closely, when he saw her walking alone in the gardens or sitting at dinner with that expression of carefully maintained composure that did not quite hide her loneliness, something would stir behind the walls he had built, some treacherous warmth that he would immediately suppress. Turning back to his ledgers and his correspondence, into the safe territory of numbers and obligations that demanded nothing of his scarred interior landscape. He told himself that what he felt when he watched her was merely aesthetic appreciation. She was graceful, well-mannered, everything a marchioness should be, and not the dangerous pull of something deeper, not the growing awareness that she read the books he loved, that her letters to her sister showed a wit and warmth he glimpsed only in fragments, that, in another life, in another version of himself that had not been forged in the crucible of his father's failures, he might have courted her in truth, might have won her regard through something other than her father's financial need. He could not allow such thoughts to take root, could not permit the possibility that he had made a terrible mistake in wedding her only to wall her out, and so he maintained his discipline, his distance, his conviction that this arrangement was what honor demanded, even as some part of him, buried deep and growing deeper still, began to understand that he was not protecting her from his inadequacy, but rather starving them both, and that the isolation he had imposed was not noble restraint, but cowardice of the most profound kind. Charlotte began, without quite knowing why, to leave traces of herself in the library, small markers of her interior life that she told herself were meaningless, even as she carefully placed each volume she had finished reading on the mahogany side table near the window, passages marked with slips of paper where words had moved her, a poem about loneliness, an essay on the courage required for hope, a novel's meditation on the distance between two people who share a bed but not a heart. She did not expect Edmund to find them, much less read them, but some quiet, desperate part of her needed to believe that communication might exist in forms other than the stilted conversations that died between them, like flowers cut too early from the stem, and so she left these small pieces of her soul disguised as casual reading, never knowing that Edmund would discover them in the late hours when he could not sleep and would stand in the lamplight reading the passages she had marked, his chest tight with an emotion he refused to name, moved by the evidence of her loneliness and her persistent, bewildering grace. What Charlotte did notice, as June warmed into July, were small changes in the household that seemed unconnected to anything she had requested. The kitchen began serving ginger tea at breakfast without her asking, precisely the thing that most eased the sickness that still plagued her mornings, and the menus shifted to include bland foods that settled more easily in her uncertain stomach. Though when she thanked Mrs. Hewitt for the consideration, the housekeeper only smiled and said, "His lordship is most particular about your comfort, my lady," words Charlotte could not quite reconcile with the husband who barely spoke to her. The gardens too began to transform in ways she attributed to the gardener's initiative. The beds near her favorite walking paths, suddenly full of the white roses and pale lavender she loved most, the bench beneath the oak tree, repaired and fitted with new cushions in fabric that matched her favorite shawl. And she would sit there in the afternoons feeling inexplicably less alone, not understanding that Edmund watched from his study window as these small gifts were arranged, that he consulted with servants about her preferences and her needs, that he orchestrated these silent offerings with the same attention he gave to estate management, pouring into wordless gestures what he could not permit himself to speak. She thought the household staff had simply grown fond of her, had taken pity on the lonely Marchioness, and decided to ease her isolation with small kindnesses, and she was grateful for it, even as she wished desperately that such consideration might come from her husband, never knowing that every careful attention, every comfort, every evidence of her preferences being observed and honored came directly from Edmund's instruction, from his growing and terrifying awareness that he cared deeply about her well-being, that her happiness had become essential to him in ways that threatened the careful architecture of his defended heart. They remained strangers in all the ways that mattered, he in his study and she in her chambers or the gardens, their paths crossing rarely and their conversations limited to the barest courtesies, and yet in this strange silent language of marked books and ginger tea, of white roses and cushioned benches, something flowed between them that neither acknowledged, a current of care and longing that ran beneath the frozen surface of their marriage, like water under winter ice, unspoken and therefore unreal, present but unacknowledged, the foundation of something that might have been love if either of them had possessed the courage to break the silence and name it true. August arrived heavy and breathless, the air thick with heat that seemed to press down upon Ashford Hall like a weight, and Charlotte's pregnancy advanced into its final stage with a difficulty that became impossible to ignore. Her ankles swelling despite Mrs. Hewitt's ministrations, her face taking on a pallor that no amount of rest seemed to ease, her movements growing labored and careful as though she carried something far more fragile than life itself. Dr. Westfield's visits, once monthly, became weekly and then twice weekly, his leather bag a harbinger of concern that he tried to mask behind professional courtesy, but Charlotte would sometimes catch fragments of his conversations with Edmund in the corridor outside her sitting room, words not meant for her ears but carried nevertheless on the summer air. Narrow hips for a first child, and delicate constitution, and, most terrifying of all, substantial risk, my lord. We must prepare for the possibility of complications. Edmund heard these pronouncements with a calm expression that cost him everything to maintain, nodding gravely as the doctor outlined precautions and preparations, discussing the arrangement of the birthing chamber with the detachment of a general planning, a military campaign. But once Westfield departed, Edmund would retreat to his study and pour himself brandy with shaking hands, the crystal decanter becoming as familiar to him as his ledgers had once been, the amber liquid doing nothing to quiet the growing terror that had taken root in his chest and spread like poison through his carefully constructed defenses. He slept less and less as August wore on, lying awake in his chambers, listening to the sounds of the house settling, wondering if Charlotte too lay sleepless in her rooms down the corridor, and sometimes near midnight he would find himself standing outside her door in his shirt-sleeves, ear pressed to the wood, listening for her breathing, for any sign of distress, the instinct to enter and see her for himself warring with his maintained distance, until he would force himself back to his own chambers, with jaw clenched against the admission of how desperately he needed to know she was well. His distraction became visible to the household in ways his earlier suppressed emotion had never been. Thornton, his steward, noticed how the Marquess would lose the thread of conversations about crop rotations and tenant concerns, his attention drifting to the windows that overlooked the gardens where Charlotte still took her slow, careful walks, and when a footman mentioned casually that her ladyship had seemed tired after her morning walk, Edmund's response was a fury so sudden and disproportionate that the entire staff learned without being told that any mention of the Marchioness overexerting herself was to be avoided at all costs. Charlotte observed these changes from within the fog of her increasing exhaustion, noticing that Edmund appeared at dinner more frequently now, though he still said little, and that his eyes followed her with an intensity she could not interpret, something almost like fear flickering in their depths before he would look away, and she wondered distantly if he was concerned about losing his heir, about the waste of her dowry, if she should die in childbed before producing the son that would secure the title, the thought bitter but familiar, and her shield against hoping for anything else. The late summer storms began in the final week of August, great thunderheads building each afternoon and breaking over the estate with violence that rattled windows and sent servants scurrying to close shutters, and Charlotte would lie in her chambers, feeling the child move restlessly within her, some primitive part of her, recognizing that the storm building inside her body would break soon, would match the fury of the weather with its own terrible power, and she was more afraid than she had allowed herself to acknowledge, afraid not just of the pain but of dying unremembered and unmourned by the husband who had given her his name, but never his heart. The evening came softly 2 weeks before the child was due, the air cooling after another oppressive August day, the sky bleeding gold and amber across the western horizon, and Charlotte found herself drawn to the garden as she had been throughout these long months, moving carefully down the stone steps with one hand pressed to the small of her aching back, her body heavy and ungainly in ways that would have embarrassed her if she had possessed the energy for such vanity. She settled onto the bench beneath the oak tree, the one with the cushions that had appeared months ago in fabric that matched her favorite shawl, though she had never understood why. And she sat watching the light fade across the carefully tended beds of white roses and pale lavender, breathing in their perfume and feeling the child shift restlessly within her, some part of her aware that these peaceful moments were numbered, that soon everything would change in ways she could not quite imagine, though her body seemed to know and prepare for what her mind could not grasp. She did not hear Edmund's approach across the grass until he was nearly upon her, his shadow falling long in the slanting light, and she looked up with surprise that must have shown plainly on her face, because he paused as though uncertain of his welcome, his hands clasped behind his back in that rigid posture she had learned meant he was uncomfortable, struggling with some internal debate that never reached the surface of his carefully controlled expression. "Lady Thornwick," he said, the formal address ablaze between them as always, "I hope I am not intruding upon your solitude." She shook her head, gestured to the space beside her on the bench with a tentative smile that felt fragile on her lips, and after a moment's hesitation he sat, leaving a careful distance between them, his attention ostensibly on the gardens, though she could feel the weight of his awareness, the tension in the line of his shoulders. They spoke of inconsequential things, their conversation as stilted and awkward as every exchange between them had been since that cold February wedding, the unusual heat of the summer, the excellent yield expected from the eastern fields, the preparations being made for the harvest, anything and everything except the truth that hung between them like morning mist, thick and obscuring and impossible to navigate. Charlotte found herself studying his profile in the fading light, the strong line of his jaw, the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights she had not known he suffered, and she felt a sudden, desperate longing to bridge the distance between them, to ask him if he ever felt the terrible loneliness that haunted her days, to confess that she had somehow fallen in love with her husband despite his coldness, or perhaps because of the small kindnesses she had noticed and attributed to everyone but him. She saw his hand move, just slightly, toward hers where it rested on the bench between them, watched his fingers extend and then curl back, the gesture aborted before it fully formed, and her heart contracted with a pain that had nothing to do with the child she carried. "You should rest, Lady Thornwick," he said finally, rising with the abruptness of a man fleeing danger, his voice rougher than usual. "The evening grows cold. You must think of your health." The formal words, the careful concern that came wrapped in distance, the retreat before anything real could pass between them. It was their pattern, familiar and suffocating, and Charlotte nodded because what else could she do, watching as he bowed slightly and turned away, walking back toward the house with measured steps that suggested control but not peace. What she could not see, because her eyes had dropped to her folded hands and the tears she would not let fall, was that Edmund stopped just beyond the hedge, out of her sight, and stood there with his head bowed and his hand pressed to his chest, as though he could physically hold together the pieces of himself that threatened to break apart. Standing there until full darkness fell, and he was certain she had gone inside, his lips moving in silent words that might have been prayers or curses or simply her name, repeated like an incantation against the terror that grew with each passing day. The storm broke on the 11th night of September, 3 weeks before Charlotte's time, arriving with a fury that seemed torn from some ancient prophecy of doom, wind howling around the corners of Ashford Hall like the keening of mourners, rain lashing the windows with such violence that the glass rattled in its frames, and servants whispered prayers as they lit extra candles against the unnatural darkness. Charlotte woke near midnight to pain, not the vague discomfort that had plagued her recent days, but something sharp and wrong, a tearing sensation low in her belly that doubled her over in the great bed, her gasp lost in a crack of thunder that shook the very foundations of the house, and she reached for the bell pull with trembling hands, managing to ring it twice before another wave of agony stole her breath and left her clinging to the bedpost with white knuckles. Mrs. Hewitt arrived within minutes, took one look at Charlotte's face and the way she held herself, and sent a maid running for the midwife and another for Dr. Westfield, her own expression settling into the grim competence of a woman who had seen enough births to recognize when nature had turned adversary rather than ally, and she helped Charlotte into the birthing chair that had been prepared weeks ago, murmuring reassurances that sounded hollow against Charlotte's whimpers of pain. The midwife came within the hour, her bag of instruments and herbs clutched against the storm, and her examination brought a tightness to her mouth that she tried to hide but could not, her hands pressing Charlotte's belly with increasing concern before she looked at Mrs. Hewitt with eyes that communicated something terrible in the language women share when men's lives hang in the balance. Edmund was in his study when Thornton found him, had been sitting in the dark watching the storm and drinking brandy he did not taste, some premonition having kept him wakeful and restless, and when his steward's white face appeared in the doorway with the words, "Her ladyship's time has come, my lord. Dr. Westfield has been summoned." He was on his feet and moving before thought could catch up to instinct, taking the stairs 2 at a time toward the family wing, where already he could hear sounds that turned his blood to ice. Hours passed, measured in Charlotte's screams that echoed through the corridors despite the storm's competition, sounds of agony that stripped away every pretense of civilization and left only animal suffering, primal and terrible, and Edmund paced the hallway outside her chambers like a caged beast, his hands clenched so tightly his nails drew blood from his palms, his mind capable of nothing but prayer and bargaining, and a terror so absolute it left no room for the careful control he had maintained his entire adult life. Dr. Westfield arrived near 3 in the morning, soaked through and grim-faced, disappearing into Charlotte's chambers with barely a glance at Edmund, and the sounds from within changed, became more urgent, the midwife's voice sharp with command, Charlotte's cries reaching a pitch that suggested something beyond pain, beyond endurance, and Edmund found himself on his knees without knowing how he had gotten there, his forehead pressed to the wall, his lips moving in desperate litanies to a god he had not addressed since his mother's funeral. Near dawn, as grey light began to penetrate the storm's fury, Dr. Westfield emerged, his shirt sleeves rolled up and spattered with blood, his face haggard and ancient, and Edmund staggered to his feet as the doctor spoke words that shattered what remained of Edmund's world. "My lord, it is very grave. The child is turned wrong, and her ladyship, the bleeding, I must tell you plainly, we are losing her." The words hung in the air between them like an executioner's blade, and Edmund heard them as though from a great distance, his mind refusing at first to comprehend what Dr. Westfield was asking, what terrible choice was being laid at his feet like a sacrifice demanded by ancient and pitiless gods. "You must choose, Lord Thornwick," the doctor repeated, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and something that might have been pity. "We can save the child or save your wife, but likely not both. The bleeding is too severe and her strength is failing. Every moment we delay is a moment lost. You must tell me now the heir, or the mother." And Edmund heard himself speaking before thought could intervene, before duty or obligation or the weight of generations could impose their tyranny upon his tongue, the words erupting from some place deeper than reason or breeding, or the careful control he had maintained all his life. "My wife," he said, his voice breaking on the words, raw and desperate and stripped of every artifice. "Save my wife. Damn the heir. Damn the title. Damn everything. Save Charlotte." He spoke her given name for the first time since their wedding vows, and it felt like shattering glass, like breaking chains, like the walls he had built around his heart crumbling to dust, and Dr. Westfield nodded once, sharply, and disappeared back into the chamber, where Charlotte's screams had given way to an ominous silence that terrified Edmund more than any sound could have done. He stood alone in the corridor as the grey dawn light crept through the windows, the storm outside diminishing to sullen rain, and he found he could not remain there, could not stand still while they fought to save her inside, could not bear the weight of what he had nearly lost without ever possessing, and his feet carried him through the silent house to the chapel, that small stone room where generations of Thornwicks had prayed and married and mourned, where he himself had stood beside Charlotte 6 months ago and promised things he had never intended to give. He fell to his knees before the altar, his carefully pressed trousers soaking up water from his storm-drenched clothes, and he who had not truly prayed since childhood found himself bargaining with a God he was not certain existed, the words pouring out in a torrent of desperation. "Take anything, take everything, my fortune, my estates, my life if you require it, my sight, my limbs, my blood. Only let her live. Please God, let her live. I have been a fool, such a fool. I have been cruel and cold, and I locked my heart away as though feeling nothing was strength when it was only cowardice. She deserved love, and I gave her isolation. She deserved tenderness, and I gave her formality. She is dying, never knowing that I—" His voice broke completely, dissolved into sobs that shook his entire frame, and he pressed his forehead to the cold stone floor, his hands clenched so tightly he could feel his bones grinding together. "Let me have the chance," he whispered into the darkness. "Let me have the chance to love her as she deserves. Let me tell her, let me show her. I will spend every day of whatever life remains to me making amends for these wasted months. Only please, please, do not take her from me. Before I can tell her, she has been the center of my world, even when I pretended she was not. That I loved her even as I held myself apart. That she made me want to be better than the broken thing my father's sins created." Edmund emerged from the chapel as the grey dawn light spread across the eastern sky, his face ravaged and pale, his eyes red-rimmed from weeping and from the kind of prayer that strips a man to his essence, and he walked back through the silent corridors of Ashford Hall like a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life, arriving at Charlotte's chambers to find the door still closed, ominous and impenetrable as a tomb. He pressed his hand against the wood, feeling the grain beneath his palm, and he could hear movement within, urgent voices speaking in tones too low to decipher, and beneath it all, a sound that had been constant through the night, but which he now realized had diminished Charlotte's cries of agony, which had torn at his soul with every utterance, had grown weaker, softer, fading like light at the end of day. He sank down with his back against the door, his legs finally refusing to hold him, and he watched as the household began to stir with the morning, servants passing with averted eyes and tear-stained faces, their grief already worn openly, as though the outcome was decided, as though death had already claimed its prize, and only the formality of announcement remained. Mrs. Hewitt came and sat beside him without speaking, this woman who had served his family since before his birth, and she placed her weathered hand on his shoulder with a gentleness that nearly broke him anew, her touch conveying what words could not, that she had seen him as a boy, had watched him harden into the cold man he had become, and that she understood something in him, had shattered in these terrible hours, and might never be whole again, regardless of what the dawn brought. The servants brought him tea he did not drink, brandy he did not taste, and he remained on the floor outside Charlotte's door, making promises to the empty air, bargaining still with whatever forces governed life and death, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I will be better. I will be the man she deserved from the beginning. I will spend every moment showing her what I was too afraid to speak. Only please, please let there be moments to spend. Let there be a life in which to make amends." Inside the chamber he could hear Dr. Westfield's voice raised in command, the midwife's responses clipped and urgent, and once he heard what might have been Charlotte's voice, so faint he could not be certain it was not merely his desperate imagination conjuring what he most needed to hear. Time stretched and contracted strangely, minutes feeling like hours and hours passing in what seemed like moments. The grey dawn light strengthening to reveal a world washed clean by the storm, but offering no cleansing for the terror that gripped Edmund's heart. And then, as the morning reached that hour when night's grip has fully released but true day has not yet claimed its dominion, the sounds from within Charlotte's chamber ceased entirely. The urgent voices fell silent, the movement stopped, and even the faint cries that had persisted through everything went quiet as death itself. Edmund's heart stopped in his chest, his breath caught in his throat, and he knew with terrible certainty that he had lost her, that his bargain had been refused, in that God or fate, or the pitiless machinery of the universe, had taken her despite his pleas, his promises, his desperate offerings of everything he possessed. He collapsed forward against the door, his forehead pressed to the wood, his hands splayed flat as though he could reach through the barrier to touch her one final time, and a sound emerged from his throat that was neither word nor cry, but something primitive and broken. The sound of a man whose world has ended while he yet draws breath, and he wept without restraint or dignity, his body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from some bottomless well of anguish. Alone in the corridor, as the household held its collective breath and waited for confirmation of the tragedy they all knew had come to pass. The door opened and Edmund looked up through tear-blurred eyes to see Dr. Westfield emerge, and the man was a figure from nightmare, his waistcoat stained dark with blood, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, showing arms marked with the evidence of the battle he had fought, his face haggard and grey with exhaustion and something else, something Edmund could not immediately identify because he had braced himself for tragedy and was prepared only for the words that would end his world. "By the grace of God, my Lord Doctor," Westfield said, his voice hoarse and wondering, carrying an inflection that Edmund's shattered mind could not at first comprehend. "She lives. They both live." The words made no sense. They were impossible, a cruel jest or a misunderstanding, and Edmund stared at the doctor without moving, without breathing, his body frozen in the collapsed posture of grief, while his mind struggled to reverse its trajectory, to turn from the abyss it had been falling into and climb back towards something that might be hope. "My lord, do you hear me?" "Doctor," Westfield said, and he reached down to grip Edmund's shoulder, his touch firm and real and grounding. "Your wife lives. She breathes. Her heart beats. I cannot explain it, but it is true, and she lives." Edmund made a sound that was half sob and half laugh, a broken thing that held all his terror and relief, and he grasped the doctor's arm with desperate strength. "You are certain? You are not she truly lives?" "A son, my Lord Doctor," Westfield continued, and there were tears on his weathered face. This man who had delivered half the babies in the county and seen every variation of joy and tragedy that attended birth, small but breathing, his cries are strong, and your wife, Lord Thornwick, I must tell you, it was the nearest thing to a miracle I have witnessed in 40 years of practice. We thought we had lost her. I was certain we had lost her. Her heartbeat had grown so faint I could barely detect it, and the bleeding would not stop. And then something changed. I cannot explain what or how. Her heart simply continued when by all rights it should have ceased, and the bleeding slowed, and she drew breath, and she lives. Impossibly but truly she lives. Edmund tried to stand and found his legs would not hold him, his body shaking so violently that Mrs. Hewitt had to help him to his feet, and Dr. Westfield steadied him with a hand under his elbow. "She is very weak, my lord. She has not yet woken, but she breathes, and that is everything. That is the miracle we did not dare pray for." Edmund moved toward the door on legs that felt borrowed from someone else's body, and he entered Charlotte's chamber to find it transformed from the sight of horror he had imagined into something hushed and sacred, the morning light streaming through windows that had been opened to clear the air of the smell of blood and fear. And there in the great bed lay Charlotte, so pale she seemed carved from marble, her dark hair spread across the pillows, and her chest rising and falling with shallow but steady breaths that were the most beautiful thing Edmund had ever witnessed. The midwife stood beside a cradle holding a tiny form wrapped in blankets, and she lifted the infant as Edmund approached. "Your son, my lord, small but perfect." Edmund looked down at the child, at the miniature face and the small fists, and he felt a surge of love and gratitude, but it was nothing compared to what he felt as he turned back to Charlotte's still form and sank to his knees beside the bed, taking her hand in both of his and pressing it to his lips, to his forehead, his tears falling onto her pale fingers as he whispered brokenly, "Thank you, thank you, thank God, Charlotte, My Charlotte, thank you for living, for breathing, for being here still." Charlotte woke from darkness as one surfaces from the depths of a fathomless ocean, slowly and with great effort, her consciousness returning in fragments that did not immediately cohere into understanding, and the first thing she became aware of was pain, not the tearing agony that had consumed her in those final remembered moments, but a deep, pervasive ache that spoke of violence done to her body, and the second thing was warmth, a pressure around her hand that felt human and solid and real. She opened her eyes with difficulty, her lids heavy as though weighted with stones, and the chamber swam into view in the soft light of late afternoon. The familiar dimensions of her rooms rendered strange by her altered perspective and by the presence that should not have been there. Edmund, asleep in the chair beside her bed, his head bowed forward and his hand clasping hers with a tenderness she had never known from him, and he was disheveled beyond recognition, his face shadowed with days of beard growth, his clothes rumpled and stained, his appearance so far removed from his usual immaculate presentation that she wondered if she was dreaming or if this was some fever vision born of her ordeal. She tried to speak and managed only a whisper, her throat raw and parched. "Edmund?" And the sound was enough to wake him, his head jerking up and his eyes opening to reveal such devastation in their depths that she drew back slightly in confusion, and then his expression transformed as he registered that she was awake, that she was looking at him, and what crossed his face was naked relief and love so profound that it seemed to illuminate him from within, no attempt to mask it or retreat behind the cold facade she had come to expect, and he brought her hand to his lips and pressed kisses to her fingers, her palm, her wrist, his tears falling hot against her skin. "Charlotte," he breathed, and her name in his mouth was a prayer and a thanksgiving. Forgive me, for all of it, forgive me." And she stared at him in bewilderment, her mind still foggy and struggling to comprehend this transformation, this man who looked like her husband, but whose every gesture spoke of emotions she had believed him incapable of feeling. "What?" she began, and he shook his head, lifting her hand to press it against his cheek, where she could feel the dampness of his tears. "You almost died, Charlotte. You were dying, and I stood outside that door knowing I had wasted every moment we had been given, knowing you would slip away, never understanding that you had become everything to me." She tried to make sense of his words, to reconcile them with the cold, distant man who had barely acknowledged her existence for the entirety of their marriage. "I do not understand," she whispered, and he made a broken sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "I nearly lost you. I nearly lost you, and you never knew. You lived in this house for months, never knowing that I loved you, that I had fallen in love with my wife somewhere between duty and denial, that every moment of distance was cowardice masquerading as honor." "Mrs." Hewitt entered then, carrying a tiny bundle, and Charlotte's confusion deepened until the housekeeper placed the infant in her arms, and she looked down at the small face, the miniature perfection of her son, and felt a surge of wonder so complete that tears spilled down her cheeks. "My baby," she whispered. "Our baby. He lives?" And Edmund nodded, his hand coming to rest gently on the child's head, his touch reverent and careful. "He lives. You both live. By grace or miracle or answered prayer, you both live. And Charlotte, I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my days ensuring you know with certainty what I was too much a fool to speak before now." Too much. Edmund drew a shaking breath and knew the moment had come to speak the truth. He had buried so deeply, he had almost convinced himself it did not exist, and he lifted his eyes to meet Charlotte's confused gaze, seeing in her exhaustion and bewilderment how little she understood of what had transpired in his heart during the months of their marriage, and the words came haltingly at first, broken by emotion he had spent a lifetime learning to suppress. "I must tell you everything, Charlotte. I must confess what manner of man you married, and what manner of coward has shared your home these long months." And he pressed her hand between both of his, as though she might anchor him through what he must say. "My father destroyed our family through his inability to master his passions. He squandered a fortune on mistresses and gaming tables, while my mother wasted away from grief, and I watched her die by inches, knowing that love had been the weapon that killed her, that her heart had been both her glory and her ruin," Edmund continued, his voice rough with the shame of old wounds. "And I vowed I would never permit emotion to compromise duty, never allow feeling to cloud judgment. I would be everything my father was not controlled, rational, a proper steward of what remained of our legacy. And Charlotte's expression shifted as understanding began to dawn, her free hand moving to touch his cheek with a gentleness he did not deserve. When I married you, it was a transaction. I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. Your dowry saved Ashford Hall, and I gave you a title in exchange. And I told myself this was honorable, that a marriage of clear terms and no false promises was better than pretty lies. That you would accept the bargain and build a life within its constraints, he said, and the words tasted bitter with their cruelty. But somewhere in those silent months, something changed in me, though I refused to acknowledge it. I would see you at breakfast and wonder what thoughts moved behind your eyes. I would hear your footsteps in the gallery and find myself listening for them. I would watch you walk in the gardens and feel something shift in my chest that I had no name for because I had forbidden myself the vocabulary of such things. Edmund's voice broke, and he had to pause, gathering himself before he could continue. I read the books you left marked in the library, Charlotte, every one of them, and I was moved by the passages you chose. I saw your heart in those selections, and it terrified me, so I ordered your favorite foods prepared, and had the gardener plant the flowers you loved, and told myself these were merely the actions of a considerate husband, nothing more, certainly nothing that resembled the feelings I had watched destroy my parents. And Charlotte made a soft sound of understanding, tears spilling down her pale cheeks as she began to comprehend the parallel solitude they had both endured. I fell in love with you, Charlotte. Somewhere between duty and denial, I fell in love with my wife, and I was too much a coward to speak it, too fearful of becoming my father, too convinced that distance was a kindness and that you deserved better than a man with a heart as damaged as mine, Edmund said, and now his own tears fell unchecked. And then you nearly died. You were dying beyond that door, and I knelt in the chapel and bargained with God for your life, offering anything, everything, if only you might live. And I understood in that moment of terror what a fool I had been, what months we had wasted, what love we might have built, if only I had possessed the courage to reach for you, instead of retreating behind walls of my own construction. And he brought her hand to his lips, kissing her fingers with desperate tenderness. You deserved poetry and passion, Charlotte. You deserved to be courted and cherished, and I gave you coldness and distance. You nearly died, never knowing that you had become the center of my world, the lens through which I saw everything, the measure of all that mattered, and I cannot bear the thought that you lived in this house, believing yourself merely tolerated when in truth you were desperately loved. Charlotte's tears came then, falling hot and unchecked as she looked at this man who had just laid his heart bare before her, and through her exhaustion and the lingering fog of her ordeal, she found her voice, weak but steady with the truth she had carried in silence for so long. Edmund, I must tell you, she began, and had to pause as emotion closed her throat. I must tell you that I loved you. And she saw his expression shift to confusion at her use of the past tense before she continued. I loved you from the first month of our marriage, perhaps before. I cannot say when it began, only that I woke one morning and realized that your presence had become the axis around which my days turned, that I listened for your footsteps in the corridor and felt my heart lift at the sound, even knowing you would not stop at my door, that I chose books, hoping you might read them and know something of my mind, since you would not permit me to speak it. She shifted the baby in her arms, looking down at their son to gather courage before meeting Edmund's eyes again. I thought myself a purchased bride, tolerated, but never cherished. I believed you had married me for my dowry, and that I was simply one more asset you had acquired to restore your estate, and I resigned myself to a loveless life because what else could I do? And her voice broke on the words. I tried to reach you, Edmund, in the only ways I knew how, with books and small attempts at conversation and presence at meals you did not attend. And when nothing I did seemed to touch you, I withdrew into my own silence, convinced that you felt nothing for me beyond perhaps a distant gratitude for the fortune I had brought. Edmund made a sound of anguish and would have spoken, but she shook her head, needing to finish what she had begun. During my pregnancy, I would walk in the gardens and imagine what it might be like if you loved me, if you looked at me with warmth instead of that careful politeness, if you touched me with tenderness instead of duty, and I would feel foolish for such fantasies, for wanting more than the bargain we had struck. And she reached out with her free hand to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his unshaven jaw beneath her fingers. "And now you tell me that all those months we were both longing in parallel, both loving in silence, both convinced the other felt nothing. And Edmund, it is tragic. It is terribly tragic that we wasted so much time, but it is also," and here her tears turned to something brighter, "it is also wondrous that we have this chance now, that I did not die never knowing you loved me, that our son will grow up in a house where his parents cherish one another rather than endure one another." Edmund caught her hand and pressed it to his lips, his tears wetting her palm, and when he spoke his voice was raw with emotion and with promise. "Never again, Charlotte. Never again will you doubt. I will spend every remaining day ensuring you know with certainty that you are loved beyond measure, beyond reason, beyond anything I knew myself capable of feeling." And he leaned forward carefully, mindful of her weakness and the infant in her arms, and kissed her with a tenderness that held all the reverence of a man who has been granted a miracle he did not deserve, their first real kiss-tasting of salt and redemption, and the beginning of something that should have begun months before, but was no less precious for its delay. And in that moment the baby stirred and let out a small cry that broke them apart, and they looked at each other and began to laugh. Softly at first, and then with real joy, the first genuine shared happiness of their marriage, blooming in the aftermath of near tragedy, like flowers forcing their way through scorched earth. The weeks that followed were a season of gradual healing, both of body and of heart, and Edmund became a constant presence in Charlotte's chambers in a way that would have been unthinkable in the cold months of their early marriage. He moved a chair beside her bed that first day after their confessions, insisting he would remain close in case she needed anything, and the chair became his place of residence. As Charlotte slowly regained her strength, and the pallor leaving her cheeks by degrees as September gave way to early October, he read to her from the novels she loved, his deep voice stumbling over the romantic passages that once he would have scorned but now rendered with careful attention, and he brought their son to her for nursing, learning to hold the tiny creature with a tenderness that seemed impossible from hands that had once touched her only with distant formality. The servants whispered in amazement at the transformation. "Mrs." Hewitt dabbing her eyes when she saw the Marquess sleeping upright in the chair, his hand clasped around his wife's even in slumber, his vigil never wavering through the long nights when Charlotte's fever briefly returned or when she wept from exhaustion and the overwhelming nature of new motherhood. "Come to bed properly, Edmund," Charlotte said one evening when she had been awake and recovering for nearly a fortnight. "You cannot continue sleeping in that chair. You will do yourself an injury, and I find I sleep better when you are near." And though he protested that he did not wish to disturb her rest or cause her discomfort in her still fragile state, she insisted with a firmness that reminded him his wife possessed a will of her own, and so he lay beside her on top of the coverlets at first, careful and distant, until she reached for him in the darkness, and he gathered her carefully into his arms, holding her as though she were made of spun glass. And they slept that way with a peace neither had known in all the months of their marriage. He learned the intimacies of her care, how she preferred her tea, what foods sat well with her recovering constitution, the way she liked her pillows arranged, the particular tone of their son's cry that meant hunger versus discomfort, and he learned fatherhood simultaneously, changing soiled linens with fumbling determination when the nurse was occupied, walking the corridors at night with the baby against his shoulder, singing old songs he half remembered from his own childhood in a voice rough with disuse. Charlotte watched him discover these new dimensions of himself with wonder and growing joy, seeing in his awkward devotion the man he might have been all along had fear not locked his heart away, and her own strength returned not merely from rest and nourishment, but from the healing balm of being cherished and of waking each morning to find Edmund's eyes upon her with an expression of such tender regard that she sometimes could not believe the evidence of her own sight. The doctor pronounced her recovery remarkable when he visited in mid-October, saying he had feared the worst, but that she had proved his pessimism unfounded. And after he departed, Edmund held her for a long moment, his face pressed into her hair, and whispered, "I will never cease being grateful, never cease remembering how nearly I lost you, how nearly we lost this chance." And Charlotte held him in return, understanding that the devotion born in crisis was not fading with dangers passing, but rather deepening into something permanent and true, the foundation of the marriage they were finally, truly beginning to build. The months that followed Charlotte's recovery brought an autumn unlike any Edmund had known at Ashford Hall, one marked not by the melancholy decline toward winter, but by a gentle ripening of intimacy that transformed the grand estate from a place of duty into something resembling a home. Charlotte regained her strength by degrees, her color returning, and her step growing steadier as October painted the gardens in amber and gold. And with her physical recovery came a blossoming confidence in her role, not merely as Marchioness, but as Edmund's true partner in all things. They began taking breakfast together each morning in the small parlor rather than the formal dining room, Edmund reading correspondence while Charlotte nursed their son, whom they had named James. After her father, and these quiet domestic hours became the foundation of their days, filled with comfortable silences, punctuated by observations about the baby's progress or plans for the estate. Edmund began including Charlotte in matters he had once guarded jealously, spreading account books and land surveys across the table after James had been taken to the nursery, explaining the intricacies of crop rotation and tenant relations with a patience that revealed how much he valued her insight, and Charlotte surprised them both with her quick grasp of figures and her thoughtful questions about improvements that might benefit both the estate's prosperity and the welfare of those who worked the land. In turn, Charlotte gently insisted that Edmund accompany her on social calls to neighboring families, something he had avoided throughout their early marriage, and though he initially resisted with the awkwardness of a man long accustomed to solitude, he found himself gradually softening under her influence, discovering that conversation and company need not be ordeals when undertaken with someone who made him feel less exposed and more complete. They walked the gardens together in the afternoons when weather permitted, James bundled in Charlotte's arms, or as he grew stronger held against Edmund's shoulder, and Edmund found unexpected joy in pointing out to his son the various features of the estate that would one day be his inheritance, though the near loss of both wife and child had fundamentally altered his understanding of legacy, teaching him that no title or property mattered against the breathing reality of the people he loved. Their evenings were spent in Charlotte's sitting room, which had become their shared sanctuary, where they read aloud to one another or simply talked, conversations stretching past midnight as they made up for the months of silence by sharing their histories, their hopes, and their fears with the honesty of people who had looked into the abyss of loss and chose vulnerability over protection. Charlotte told Edmund of her childhood, of the pressure to marry well and her terror on their wedding day that she would disappoint him, while Edmund spoke haltingly of his parents' disastrous union and his determination never to repeat his father's mistakes, though he acknowledged bitterly that in avoiding one form of failure he had nearly created another by denying them both the warmth they might have shared from the beginning. There were moments of laughter too, genuine and unguarded, like the morning James spit up on Edmund's formal waistcoat just before a meeting with his steward, or the evening Charlotte discovered Edmund asleep in the nursery chair, the baby contentedly drooling on his father's chest. And these small domestic absurdities became precious to them both as evidence that they were building not just a marriage of renewed commitment, but a life of authentic joy. Edmund would catch himself sometimes simply watching Charlotte as she moved through the house that had once seemed to swallow her with its grandeur, seeing how she had transformed it through her presence into a place of warmth, and he would feel a wonder bordering on disbelief that this happiness was his, that he had been granted the chance to become the husband he should have been from the beginning, and Charlotte in turn would observe Edmund's growing ease with their son and with her, and would think that the man she had married in duty had finally, truly become the man she had fallen in love with in silence, only better for having been refined by nearly losing everything that mattered. Their first wedding anniversary arrived on a cold December morning, exactly 1 year from the day Charlotte had stood in a church filled with strangers, and bound herself to a man whose eyes had held no tenderness, and the contrast between that bleak ceremony and the day Edmund had planned could not have been more profound, for he had spent weeks preparing in secret with Mrs. Hewitt's delighted assistance, determined to show Charlotte what their wedding day should have been, had he possessed the courage then that near loss had granted him now. He woke her with breakfast brought on a tray himself rather than by servants, and presented her with a simple bouquet of hothouse roses, her favorite. Though she had never told him, his knowledge gleaned from months of careful attention, and told her to dress warmly, that he had something to show her, his expression holding an almost boyish nervousness that made her heart swell with affection for this man who had been so changed by crisis into someone capable of vulnerability. He led her through the frost-rimed gardens to the chapel on the estate grounds, the small stone building where he had knelt a year ago in September darkness and bargained with God for her life. And she understood his intention when she saw that he had filled it with candles and winter greenery, transforming the simple space into something sacred and intimate. And when he turned to her in that golden light, his hands were trembling slightly as he drew folded papers from his coat. "I want to speak vows to you again," Edmund said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "But these will be the words I should have spoken a year ago, words of love rather than duty. The promises made not because convention demands them, but because my heart cannot contain what I feel without giving it voice and witness." And Charlotte felt tears already beginning as he unfolded the papers and began to read what he had written, vows that spoke of his unworthiness and his gratitude, his wonder at her grace, his promise to spend every day of his remaining life ensuring she knew herself cherished beyond all things, his acknowledgement that she had saved him from a half-life of emotional cowardice and given him not merely an heir, but a reason to become a man worthy of the gift he had been granted. When he finished, Charlotte spoke her own vows without paper or preparation, simply opening her heart and telling him that she forgave the coldness of their beginning because it had taught them both the precious nature of what they had found, and that she loved him not despite his imperfections, but with full knowledge of them, that she chose him freshly each morning and would continue choosing him until her final breath. And they sealed these promises with a kiss that held both the tenderness of new love and the depth of shared suffering transformed into intimacy. Afterward, back in the warmth of the house, Edmund presented her with a wooden box containing legal documents prepared by his solicitor, and when Charlotte opened it and read the deed to Ashford Hall, she looked up in confusion until he explained gently, "You purchased it with your dowry. You nearly died within its walls, giving me an heir. It should be yours, the security you deserve." But before she could protest, he took her hands and said with utter sincerity, "Everything I have is yours, Charlotte, the estate and the fortune and the title, but most especially my heart, which has always been yours even when I was too much a coward to offer it. And I wanted you to know that this house, which once held only loneliness for you, is yours now to fill with whatever joy you choose." And Charlotte wept then and held him, understanding that this gift was his way of acknowledging all that she had endured and all that she had brought to a marriage that had nearly been stillborn, but had instead become the foundation of both their lives. 2 years passed with the swift gentleness of a river in summer, carrying Edmund and Charlotte further from the dark September night that had nearly ended their story before it truly began. And in that span of time, Ashford Hall transformed from a place that had once echoed with loneliness into a home alive with warmth and the particular chaos that accompanies young children and genuine happiness. Charlotte was with child again, her condition evident in the soft swell beneath her morning dress as she sat in the refurbished drawing-room on an April afternoon. And though Edmund's anxiety had been pronounced when she first told him the news, his face draining of colour as memory of blood and terror resurfaced unbidden. Charlotte had taken his face in her hands and promised him with calm certainty that this time would be different, that she was stronger now, and the doctor had assured them her body had recovered fully from the trauma of James's birth, and gradually Edmund's fear had been tempered by her confidence, though he remained vigilantly attentive to her every need and comfort. The house itself reflected the change that had come over its inhabitants, for where once the grand rooms had stood silent and formal, they now frequently filled with guests. Charlotte, having coaxed Edmund into hosting dinners and small house parties that brought neighbours and even a few carefully selected members of London society to witness the unlikely transformation of the Marquess of Thornwick from a cold, austere aristocrat into a man known throughout the county for his devotion to his wife and his surprising warmth when in her presence. Music echoed through halls that had known only silence, for Charlotte had engaged a music master and was learning the pianoforte with Edmund's encouragement, and on evenings when they had no guests, Edmund would sit near her as she practiced, James playing with wooden blocks at his father's feet, and these moments of domestic simplicity had become more precious to Edmund than any accomplishment of his former life. James himself was now walking that peculiar toddler stumble that was half-controlled fall, and Edmund had discovered in himself depths of paternal affection he had not known possible, often ending his days with his son perched on his shoulders as they made a tour of the gardens before bedtime. Charlotte walking beside them, with her hand resting lightly on Edmund's arm, the picture of a family so complete that those who had known Edmund in his cold earlier incarnation could scarcely credit the change. On this particular afternoon, Charlotte watched from the drawing-room window as Edmund crouched in the garden with James, showing the boy something in the flower bed, a beetle or perhaps an early butterfly, and the patience and gentleness in his movements made her heart swell with the kind of contentment she had once believed impossible, and when Edmund looked up and caught her watching, he smiled with such open affection that she felt blessed beyond measure. That evening, after James had been delivered to the nursery and they sat together in the quiet of their private sitting room, Edmund drew Charlotte against his side and said softly, as though the thought had just occurred to him, though she suspected he had been carrying it for some time, "I thought I was saving the estate with your dowry, securing the future of a title and property that had been in my family for generations, fulfilling my duty as my father had failed to fulfill his." And he paused, his hand moving to rest gently on her rounded belly where their second child grew. "But I did not know, could not have imagined, that you would save me from a half-life of duty without joy, from the cold prison of my own making, from becoming the bitter shell of a man I was well on my way to being." And Charlotte turned to kiss him softly, thinking that they had both been saved that terrible night, both given the chance to become the people they were meant to be, together. 5 years passed like a blessing counted in seasons, and on a June morning when sunlight poured golden through the windows of Ashford Hall and the gardens beyond bloomed with roses that Charlotte herself had chosen, the house had become something neither Edmund nor Charlotte could have imagined in those dark early days of their marriage, a home alive with the particular music of children's laughter and the deep contentment of two people who had found each other almost too late and now treasured every ordinary moment as the gift it was. 3 children now, James at 5 years old, tall for his age and possessing his father's dark eyes though his temperament was sunnier, Catherine at 3, a sprite of a girl with Charlotte's fair colouring and a stubborn determination that delighted them both, and baby Thomas, just past his first year, who had arrived without the terror that had accompanied James's birth, Edmund weeping with relief when Charlotte had delivered him safely after only 6 hours of labour, and the doctor had proclaimed both mother and child perfectly well. On this particular morning, Charlotte stood at the drawing-room window watching Edmund in the garden with all 3 children, James helping his father examine the rose bushes, while Catherine attempted to catch butterflies with more enthusiasm than success, and Thomas sat on a blanket nearby, grasping at grass with the fierce concentration peculiar to infants, and the scene before her was so complete, so entirely what she had dreamed of in those lonely early months when she had believed herself condemned to a loveless existence, that she felt tears prick her eyes, though they were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. Edmund looked up as though sensing her gaze, and even across the distance she could see his smile, the openness that had replaced the cold mask he had worn when first she knew him, and he said something to James before starting toward the house. And when he entered the drawing-room moments later, he came directly to her and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder as they both looked out at their children. "Do you remember," Edmund said quietly, his breath warm against her ear, "that first year when I barely spoke to you, when I treated you as though you were merely a transaction recorded in a ledger rather than a woman who had given up everything familiar to become my wife?" And Charlotte nodded, for though the memory had lost its power to wound, it remained clear, and Edmund continued, "I have thought lately about the man I was then, how close I came to destroying both our lives through cowardice dressed as duty. And Charlotte, I bargained with God that terrible night and thought I knew what I was asking. I asked for your life, simply that you would live, that I would not have to endure a world that no longer contained you." And he turned her gently to face him, his hands framing her face with a tenderness that still, after 5 years of his devotion, had the power to make her heart quicken. "But he gave me so much more than survival. He gave me a life, this life, our life, fuller and richer than I knew to want, and every day I wake grateful that I was granted the chance to become worthy of what I had nearly thrown away." Charlotte kissed him softly, thinking that they had both been transformed by that night of blood and prayer, both given the opportunity to become the people they were meant to be, And as they stood together, watching their children play in the summer garden of a house that had once been cold as a mausoleum and was now warm as a heart, she understood that some blessings arrive wrapped in terror, and that the marriage which had begun as transaction had become the foundation of everything that mattered. Dear listener, there is wisdom in their story that transcends the particulars of title and estate. For how many of us construct walls around our hearts and call it wisdom, practice distance and name it dignity, we withhold the words that matter most and tell ourselves there will always be time. Later, when the moment is more convenient, or we are more certain, or the risk seems less frightening. Edmund and Charlotte nearly lost everything because they allowed fear and pride to silence truth, and only when confronted with unbearable loss did Edmund find the courage to offer what he should have given freely from the beginning, his whole heart, vulnerable and undefended. Crisis has a terrible gift, for it strips away all that is inessential and reveals what we truly value. But how much better to recognize those truths before tragedy forces the recognition, and to speak love while there is still easy time, to build intimacy through dailiness rather than having to resurrect it from the ashes of near loss. If you find yourself holding back words of affection or appreciation, waiting for a better moment or a worthier recipient or a braver version of yourself, remember Edmund kneeling in a chapel, bargaining for one more chance to love his wife as she deserved. And ask yourself what you are waiting for, what calamity you imagine must arrive before you allow yourself the vulnerability of truth. May you find the courage to offer your whole heart before crisis demands it. May you speak love in the ordinary moments rather than only in the extraordinary. And may you rest tonight in the peace that comes from knowing that those you treasure understand themselves treasured. For there is no tragedy quite like love unspoken until it is too late, and no grace quite like the daily choice to build connection rather than walls. Thank you for listening to this story, brought to you with hope that it might encourage one soul toward earlier courage, and may you find in your own life the transformation that Edmund and Charlotte discovered, not through perfection, but through the willingness to be known completely and to love without reservation. Sleep well, dear listener, and wake tomorrow ready to speak the truths your heart contains.